Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Welcome back to Butler on Business, and on the phone with us now, it is my privilege and honor to say we have John Williams of Shadow Stats, shadowstats.com. I have been a long-term subscriber to John's service. You should be too. John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I mean, it's truly a privilege. You keep me well informed. I know the answer to this question is in the primer on your website, but how did you wind up getting into the business of tracking the information that's coming out of the government?
Well, I've been a private consultant, economic consultant now for 30-plus years, and early on I found out there were indeed some serious problems with the government statistics. One of my first accounts was a large manufacturer of commercial airplanes, and they used revenue passenger miles as their basic forecasting tool, and they had a model that would make forecasts on that based on the government's GDP, or at least it's called the GDP now. It was actually the GNP measure back then. Suddenly, the model wasn't working, and I looked at it and found that, indeed, there were some serious flaws in the GNP reporting tied to trade. I corrected for that. The model began working again. And I soon found that there were a lot of other issues with the government data that I got to the point that I actually first surveyed business economists as to how they looked at it, and go to business economist conventions. I asked a number of them what they thought of the government statistics, very specific numbers, which were good, which were bad. About 70% of them thought that generally the statistics had horrible problems, and that there was also political manipulation. But one fellow I found, chief economist for a big retail operation, he said, the retail sales are absolutely worthless. They don't help us at all. We don't even look at them. But I think the money supply numbers are pretty good. The next guy I surveyed was a chief economist for a large New York bank, and he said, the money supply numbers are absolutely horrible, but I like the retail sales. I think that's a pretty good series. And indeed, the people who knew the specific series well, had to work with them, knew where the flaws were, and they are significant in many areas, but assumed that the other numbers were fine. What's happened over time, and the reason I'm doing what I'm doing now, is that I found that the public has a pretty good sense of what's going on, and the public perceptions have varied widely, and the variance is increasing over time against what the government's reporting. People tend to think that inflation's higher than reported, and that, as is unemployment, and that the economic growth reported by the government is overstated. The reasons for that generally are tied to methodological changes that have been made over the years that have effectively put upside biases into the economic data and downside biases into inflation.
Well, as a student of your publications, and I read them word for word and study them, this past weekend, for example, with the news media and our politicians reading that headline U3 number of theirs, I can only imagine, as frustrated as I am knowing what the accurate picture was, how frustrated you are when you hear it, or have you become desensitized to it?
No, it's still very frustrating because very few people in the media pay close attention to the numbers. The markets take these numbers as if they're absolutely the most accurate numbers that have ever come into play, when in fact not only are they do they have large margins of error around them, but in this last reporting you had big changes to the way the numbers were reported, and any time you have big swings that come with that, and where they try to make the numbers consistent with past history, you have to be very suspect of the numbers there. What happened with the unemployment rate is that it doesn't reflect common experience. If you went around and you asked everyone in the country whether or not he or she was employed or unemployed, you get a straight answer very quickly. People don't have to hesitate on that. They know whether or not they're unemployed. And you'd get a much higher unemployment rate putting all those numbers together than what the government does. The government publishes, at least in the headline number. The headline number, which is the U3, as you mentioned, it defines people who are unemployed, aside from their being out of work and willing and able to take a job, is that they have to have looked for work in the last 4 weeks. If they haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks because they haven't been able to find a job, they're considered discouraged workers. They're counted, but they're not included in the headline number, and they're not included in the headline labor force. And there's where you have a big problem right now, because increasingly people are finding it difficult to find jobs. They stop looking. They still consider themselves unemployed. They would take a job if they could find it, but where they haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, the government has a broader measure. The broadest measure actually is the U6 level. They have 6 levels of unemployment they report. Back in 1994, the government redefined the series, redefined discouraged workers, so that if they were discouraged for less than a year, they'd count them in their broad measure, but if they'd been discouraged for more than a year, they didn't track them at all. And that change knocked a lot of people out of the broad unemployment measure. I do my best to estimate where that stands and put that back into play. You're looking at an unemployment rate that's up over 22%, which is, I'll contend that's pretty much what you'd find if you went around and asked everyone whether or not they were unemployed and tallied that up.
If we had what you refer to as the SGS alternative, I think you had it at 22.5% at the end of January.
Right.
And the participation rate, is now sitting at, 63.7%. That gap between the 22% in the alternative unemployment rate and the implied 33%, that 11 basis point gap, what do you attribute that to?
Well, that is that's what you're hitting at, and is in terms of the participation rate. People, as they once they drop out of the U3 employment category or unemployed category, they're no longer counted in the workforce. So what you've seen happen in this severe economic downturn has been a declining portion of people in the workforce versus the population. And it isn't that people are retiring. I mean, people always retire, but the big problem here has been that people have stopped looking because they can't find jobs. And to say that they're not unemployed because they can't find a job I think is stretching things. Again, the average person who thinks he's unemployed is often in that type of a circumstance where, although he wants a job and he'd take a job immediately, may desperately want a job, if there just aren't any jobs where he is, it's difficult to look for one, and you can see how they give up looking and hope that the tide will change or whatever. But the big difference there is the dropping participation rate in the headline labor force.
And you had thought they were getting ready to define or compact the labor force even more?
Well, that's had the effect of actually lowering the unemployment rate. You have a lower unemployment rate, but you have more people who think they're unemployed. And, yes, that's going to continue. So there's nothing there to suggest a turnaround. In fact, with all the revamping they did in the numbers on Friday, the situation ended up looking
quite rosy,
significantly worse than it was before. Well, there are two surveys. The household survey is the one that gives you the unemployment rate, and there the headline number is dropping, but the broader number people who think they're unemployed, that's increasing. My number actually went up 0.1% instead of down 0.2%, which the government's number did, and that's because there are more people looking for jobs, or we're not looking for jobs, but would like a job, but they've given up looking for one because they can't find it. What they call the establishment survey, the government gets reports from companies all over the United States in terms of the number of people they have on payrolls as of the week that includes the 12th of the month. And the increase that they had there, that's after seasonal adjustment, indeed. And it's otherwise, if you take the raw data, because of, among other things, in December where you have the holiday shopping time and a lot of people hired there, those people get laid off in January. Normally, the people on payrolls, the number drops 2.7, 2.8 million people. What's happened here is that we've had terrible seasonal factor distortions from this severe economic downturn. I mean, the downturn has been so deep and so protracted that it's thrown off all the mathematical models that were designed basically for normal economic times, that are used to smooth the numbers and to give you an economic estimate of what happened in terms of the numbers being up or down. I'll contend those seasonal adjustments are so irregular and unstable at this point in time that number could have gone either way, up or down, by that amount, if not more. The meaning, the actual change that was reported was not statistically meaningful. But I'll tell you what is meaningful, and that is you take the number as reported, and that included a benchmark revision. The level of payrolls just reported, the numbers that got the markets all excited about economic recovery. That level is lower than it was 11 years ago. Level of employment today is below where it was 11 years ago. It certainly is also well below where it was coming into the so-called 2007 recession. But we've seen no economic recovery here. At the same point in time that you've had no growth in employment now for that extended period of time, the population's gone up by 10%. This is not a normal economic recovery. We have a major structural problem here where the average homeowner can't stay ahead of inflation, and he's having trouble borrowing money. And unless he's got income growing faster than inflation, or can expand his debt at a pace to beat inflation, you have no chance of having a sustainable economic recovery. So that what we're seeing here is a very severe labor problem that likely is going to get worse as we go ahead in the year, not better.
John, do you think, since either going to your website or subscribing to your service to get the accurate number, or going through the weeds of those government reports, the information is there, it's readily available? These big news operations certainly have somebody that can spend a little bit of time checking out the numbers. Why do they go with this bogus headline number, whether it's inflation, whether it's unemployment, GDP? I mean, are they complicit? They lazy, ignorant, all of the three?
Well, all of the three, but what you have to keep in mind is that good news sells better than bad news. And in terms of the numbers, if you're getting the numbers from the government, you tend to in the media, a lot of people will treat the government well because they like to have a happy, ongoing relationship there. The people that they'll seek for comment often are analysts off of Wall Street, and Wall Street has its own biases. It likes to see particularly likes to see happy economic news reported, and that's irrespective of what's happening in the economy. They have product they want to sell. They don't want to discourage investors. Politicians like to see it happy. So you have pressures from all sorts of sides. The people on Wall Street are key advertisers in a lot of the financial media. So there are all sorts of conflicts there. But the average guy tends to take what comes out of the government. He'll maybe get a comment from someone on Wall Street, and you don't get an analysis that would cause him otherwise grief. I don't sell stocks or bonds. I just sell my information, and if people don't like it, they don't have to buy it. But I try to give as honest a picture as possible of that.
Well, I find it to be very useful because if you look at the official narrative, you've got one picture. If you look at the actual data, you have another. And knowing eventually this, when you're pregnant, you wind up having the baby, this information will eventually have to get out.
Yes, it will. But beyond that, again, one of the key things, I can't emphasize this enough, the key thing I found over time is that the average person has a pretty good sense of what really is going on. If you don't trust the government's numbers, they don't make sense to you, go with your gut instinct. You're probably a lot closer to reality.
Well, John, I could talk to you all day, but we are over our time. I hope that you will come on again soon.
Be my pleasure. Thanks again so much for having me.
Well, it's been an honor to have you. John Williams, shadowstats.com. Well worth the time, well worth the money, John. Thank you. We look forward to having you on again.
Thanks again.